Masechta Beya, Perek Beis, Mishnah Aleph. Yom Tov shechal yis erev Shabbos lo yivashel adam matchilum Yom Tov l'Shabbos, aval mevashel hu l'Yom Tov v'im hoiser l'Shabbos. When Yom Tov falls on Friday, it's mutter to cook that day for the next day, which is Shabbos. In reality, the Torah is matter cooking on Yom Tov only what's needed for that day. It's also to cook on Yom Tov for the next day. However, it is mutter to cook extra food on Yom Tov if it might possibly be used later that day. For example, for unexpected guests who arrive later in the day. The Chachamim made use of the principle known as Hoyel v'mikloi le'orchim. Since guests might visit, or simply as Hoyel. Hoyel is referencing this whole phrase, to permit cooking for Shabbos when Yom Tov falls on Friday. This halacha applies only when there's enough time left in the Yom Tov day for the food to cook and be eaten that day. Otherwise, it's asam in Torah to cook on Yom Tov for any other day, even for Shabbos. The Chachamim, however, assered cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos unless one began cooking before Yom Tov. People will note that since they're forbidden to cook on Yom Tov, even for Shabbos, they're certainly forbidden to cook for Yom Tov to a weekday. And that's pretty clear in the Gemara like that. So our Mishnah discusses this Issa D'Rabbanan and the way around it. So again, Yom Tov shechal yetz erev Shabbos le'yavash batchilum Yom Tov l'Shabbos. The Chachamim decreed that when Yom Tov falls on Friday, one may not begin cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos, aval mevashel hu l'Yom Tov v'im hoiser l'Shabbos. Rather, he may cook only what he actually needs for Yom Tov, but if he left over any Yom Tov food, he may use what he left over for Shabbos. Although the Chachamim are cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos, they also paskin that if one begins cooking for Shabbos before Yom Tov, he may continue cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos. This allowed them to institute the following procedure to be matter cooking on Shabbos. However, one may prepare a cooked dish before Yom Tov for Shabbos and rely on it to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos. Since he began preparing food before Yom Tov for Shabbos, the Chachamim were matter him to continue doing so on Yom Tov. In this case, the Chachamim were not concerned that he might think he's mutter to cook on Yom Tov for a weekday, since he will see that even for Shabbos, he's mutter only to finish what he began before Yom Tov. This rabbinical arrangement, which is matter cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos, is known as Erev Tavshilin. Erev Tavshilin literally means combining cooked dishes, meaning it is given this name because it allows a person to cook a combination of dishes in Yom Tov, some for Yom Tov and some for Shabbos. The Mishnah now brings a machlekes about how many cooked foods are needed for an Erev Tavshilin. Beishamai says Shnei Tavshilin. Beishamai say 2 cooked dishes are required, since at least 2 cooked dishes are usually eaten at a Shabbos meal. A person cannot be viewed as having started to prepare for Shabbos unless he cooked 2 dishes. Beis Hillel Emrim Tavshil Echad, but Beis Hillel say 1 cooked dish is enough because sometimes only 1 cooked dish is eaten at a Shabbos meal. All agree, even Beishamai agrees, that fish broiled with an egg on top, the egg was smeared over the fish when it was broiled. It's considered 2 cooked dishes with respect to Erev Tavshilin, even though they're cooked together. The Mishnah discusses problems that may arise with the food that was cooked for an Erev Tavshilin. If it was eaten or lost before one started cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos, one may not rely on that cooked food to begin cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos. Since the Erev is missing, he is in effect now starting to cook for Shabbos. However, if he started a dish when the Erev was still present, he may finish what he had begun. However, if some of it remained, at least the kezayis remained. This is the minimum required for an Erev Tavshilin in the first place. He may rely on what remains to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos. Now, it's a very interesting word I heard from a dear friend of mine that the Gemara says in Yuma that Avraham Avinu was Mekayim Kol Terakula Ad Shleitna Mafilu Ayin Tes. So some people say it stands for Erev Tchumen, because Erev Tchumen, we spoke in Erevin, it's a big machlekes. It's very not pashut if it's the Raisa, if it's the Rabbanon, how it works, what the Isser is. But it could also, and maybe even more accurately, stand for Ayin Tes, could stand for Erev Tavshilin, because the whole heter to cook on Yom Tov is Hoyel v'imikloi le'orchim. Since guests might visit, and they may arrive they may be unexpected guests who arrive later in the day. Now, Avraham Avinu's every child going to kindergarten knows that Avraham Avinu had a lot of guests. So it's definitely more mistaber to say that Avraham Avinu needed to cook a lot of food for Yom Tov. So it would be ganz mistaber to say that Avraham Avinu had Ayin Tes Erev Tavshilin. Mishnah Beis Chaliyos Achara Shabbos Beishamai Omer Matbilin as a Kolman Lefnei Shabbos Beis Hillel Omer Kelim Lefnei Shabbos VeOdam Shabbos. What are we talking about over here? A person is mechuyev to be metaher atzmei beregel. A person is obligated to immerse himself in his utensils in a mikveh before Yom Tov, so that he and his utensils will be tahar on Yom Tov. This is a Gemara. The Torah asks somebody who is tamei to enter the Beis Hamikdash or to eat kachim. Since there's a mitzvah for all males to go to the Beis Hamikdash during these Yomim Tovim, the Shalosh Regalim, and bring karbanos and eat their meat, a person must make himself tahar on Yom Tov, before Yom Tov, so he'll be allowed to enter the Beis Hamikdash and eat kachim. His kelim must be tahar as well, since they need to be used for eating the karbanos. So Chaliyos Achar Shabbos. So when Yom Tov falls the day after Shabbos, meaning on Sunday, so Beis Shammai say Matbilin as a kol l'fnei Shabbos, we must immerse everything, people and utensils before Shabbos, meaning on Friday. Immersing them on Shabbos and Yom Tov is also because it resembles repairing a utensil, which is also on Yom Tov. Being terrible people and utensils that are tamei make them fit for uses that were previously usher. For example, immersed utensils, kelim, may be used to hold kachim or truma, a purpose for which they were unfit when they were tamei. So there's a masak and moneh, there's a makabeh melocha, makabeh patish by being terrible on Shabbos and or Yom Tov. So Beis Shammai they have to be terrible everything before Shabbos. Now, the only issue with that is, and hopefully it won't happen, but it's very shaykh that something can make it tamei, so you'll have to hold on to your tara for a little bit longer. Beis Hillel say kelim l'fnei Shabbos, utensils must indeed be immersed before Shabbos for the reason given above, because of masak and moneh. Be odom b'Shabbos, but a person may immerse himself on Shabbos because doing so does not give the appearance of masak and moneh. Beis Hillel, the reason for Beis Hillel is that when a person immerses himself, he appears to be merely cooling off or enjoying a bath and not making himself tahar. He's mishum denira kemekar kemitztanen v'rechetz l'tainuk v'lo l'shem tvila. It's not necessarily klar, it's not necessarily 100% nikar in the ma'aseh that he's doing it to be masak and moneh, and it's maybe more that he's doing it to enjoy himself. Mishnah Gimel V'shavin shemashikin esamayim b'kli even l'taron avaloi matbilin. Although Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue as to whether a person may immerse himself on Shabbos or Yom Tov, they are moida about the halacha of immersing tamei water on these days. What does it mean, tamei water? So tamei water is made tahor through the process of hashaka, bringing into contact. An open container of water, that's tamei, is lowered into a mikveh until the water in the container slightly touches the water in the mikveh. Through touching the mikveh, water is transformed into part of the mikveh and becomes tahor. This works only for water. Other tamei food or drink cannot become tahor through this method. So Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that on Shabbos Yom Tov you may bring tamei water that's in a stone utensil, b'kli even l'taharon, to bring it into contact with mikveh water to make the water tahor, because making water tahor does not resemble misak and moneh. The tamei water is not repaired. You're not being misak in the water through hashaka. Rather, it loses its separate identity when it merges with the mikveh water. As such, hashaka cannot be compared to misak and moneh. Because making water, this container must be made out of stone, because stone utensils do not become tamei. With the Rabbanon, tamei water will make the keli tamei. So therefore, if the container holding the tamei water were made of something that could become tamei, like wood, so then the container would become tamei from the water in it. It would then need to be immersed in the mikveh to make it tahor, so that it doesn't recontaminate the water in it when it's removed from the mikveh. This is usher, as the next part of the Mishnah teaches, which we'll see in a second. Therefore, the tamei water must be lowered into the mikveh in a kli even, which doesn't become tamei, and thus does not need to be made tahor. Avaloi matbilin, but we may not put the tamei water into a tamei utensil and then immerse it and be metaher the utensil, the keli with the tefillah along with the mayim, because it's forbidden to be metaher a keli on Shabbos and Yom Tov, as we learned in the previous Mishnah. Although the Chacham are matter being metaher water on Shabbos through hashaka, they were not matter someone to take advantage of this kula and be metaher his kelim at the same time. Well, you could say, well, once I'm doing hashaka with the waters, and then I for sure could use the keli that it's coming with. Over here, there's Xerid Rabbanon that we're saying that you're not allowed to do that. Umatbilin migav legav. The Mishnah presents two cases of immersing kelim where one intends not to make them tahor, but to increase their levels of tahara. Umatbilin migav legav. On Shabbos and Yom Tov, you may immerse a utensil in order to take it from being tahor for a less sacred purpose to being tahor for a more sacred purpose. Since a tefillah of this type merely increases the level of tahara and doesn't change the keli from being tamei to tahor, so it doesn't resemble the misak and moneh. For example, the utensil had been immersed before Yom Tov for the purpose of using it with truma, and then on Yom Tov, if the owner wants to be tevel it again, so he could use it for kachim. which is more kaddish than truma. Although this tefillah is mechuyev, as the Mishnah says at the end of in Masechta Chagiga, it doesn't resemble Masach and Mana that was broken, since the tefillah does not remove any tumah but merely adds tara. So the Bichlal and Hilchos Tumah V'Dara, which we spoke about and we'll continue to talk about throughout the rest of the shiurim on Mishnayos, B'Frat and Seder Taras, but obviously there's different levels. But you have to remove the tumah and replace it with tara, and here we're replacing it with the even higher level of tara. Umechabura lechabura, and we may immerse a keli when taking it for one group that's gathered for the Korban Pesach to another such group, because such a tefillah does not actually change the status of the utensil at all. What are we talking about over here? Chabura, Korban Pesach, what is this? Im hitbil kelim, I'm going to read the Rab, im hitbil kelim, if he was table kelim, amanas lacha pischim chabura, so he was table as kelim that he could eat the Korban Pesach betara with this chabura, and then he changed his mind or whatever it was that happened, he switched to another chabura to eat the Korban Pesach with ubala hatbil kelav pam shniya, and he wants to be tayvel the kelim a second time. Oisa hatvila mutar lasoisa b'yamtiv. So being tayvel it the second time is mutar to do it on yamtiv because it never really became tameh. The Mishnah refers to someone who was tayveling a utensil that became tameh before Yom Tov for the purpose of using it to eat the Korban Pesach with one group of people. He then changed his mind and decided to join a different group. It's not necessary for him to be tayvel the utensil a second time. Therefore, if he wants to go to Fnim Yeshua Sadin and be tayvel it again, he may certainly do so on Yom Tov, since this tefillah does not accomplish anything halachically. It doesn't change the status of anything. It's just Tosefes Kedusha, which is very interesting, just to be ma'ayir that the people that talk about that they were mevatel the tefillas Ezra, they weren't mevatel the tefillas Ezra al pi halach. If you go to the sugya, it's pretty clear that meikar adin the Gemara. You don't have to. Many people will tell you this. People only go now because it's Tosefes Tara. I will say no, it's only Chassidish Shemaisa Tosefes Tara. I don't know. We're seeing pretty clearly here in the Mishnah that a person wants to use his kelim for a carbon, and nothing really happened other than maybe a slight hesach hadas, switching from one chabura to another. We're not saying that there's any tumah here, b'chlal, not even like a shemetz of tumah or a pagam of tumah, something that like would be a minor issue. Nothing became also over here. It doesn't need to make anything mutter, but you see that he wants to have a tesefes tara, he wants to have a tesefes kedusha for his carbon. Avad, this is all of Nimshur said then, it's avad it's meikar adin, but you see clearly that there was a concept that this is what people wanted to do. It's just very interesting ha'ara, because people won't like this so much if they're so busy with you don't have to go. Ma'aseh, the previous mission, it said that a person is mechuyev l'tara atzmei b'regel, which is why a lot of people go to the mikveh these days before Yom Tov. Some hold that kohanim, if they're being if they're duchening, so then they should be tayvel, because that would be similar to avoid in the Beis Hamikdash, and you need to be tahor for that. So in Eretz Yisrael, according to this, they would have to, in places where they duchen every day, they would have to be tayvel. According to this, they would have to be tayvel every day. Again, this is not meikar hadin. This is all the Fnim Yeshua Hadin, but it's all Midas Chasidus, if you will. But in Mitzvah Hashem, we'll discuss it more when we get when these things come up again. Mishnah Dalet. Every man is mechuyev to visit the Beis Hamikdash, to be mekayim the mitzvah of Riyah on Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkos, and bring two karbanos, the oilas Riyah and the Shalmei Chagiga, as we'll see in Masechta Chagiga. The oilas Riyah is an oila which is entirely burnt in the mizbeach, and the Shalmei Chagiga is a shlamim whose meat is eaten by the bailam, his family, and his guests, and like all other personal karbanos, these karbanos require smicha, leaning on the animal. Before the carbon is shechted, the owner places his hands on the head of the animal and leans down on it with all his strength. The Mishnah brings the machlekes as to whether one may bring these karbanos on Yom Tov itself, and whether one may perform smicha on them, which is very interesting with the story that happened. The first machlekes in learning that ever happened was Indian smicha on karbanos. And with the Shem Chanukah time, we talk about it a lot. Of why, it's be'etam a riboy of Torah Shabbal Peh. It's not pshat that like things crumbled and things were falling apart. It was the concept of machlokes was to create a riboy of Torah and not animosity. So Beishamei Ermim Mevin Shlom Vein Tzayim Chanaleim, you may bring the Yishalmei Chagiga on Yom Tov because the meat is eaten, but you may not perform smicha on them because leaning on the animals is also on Yom Tov. Since the Shalmei Chagiga is eaten and the malachas of shechting and cooking on Yom Tov, one may bring this carbon in Yontif. Now, why is it that it's also to be Saimech on the animals according to Beis Shammai? The Chachamim answered riding an animal on Shabbos Yontif because they feared that as a person is riding, he might break off a branch of a tree to use as a whip, which is an Isser Deraisa. So the Isser Derabanan includes not only riding, but any direct use of an animal's body. The act of smicha is therefore also in Yontif, because the person leans down on his head with all his strength, is using it to support his weight. Beis Shammai hold that smicha does not have to be performed immediately before shechita of the carbon or even the same day. Hence, one who offers an animal on Yontif, Shalmei Chagiga, when smicha would be aser, he could do smicha on Erev Yontif. Beis Shammai hold that you don't need it. According to quote the Rav, the less l'hula Beis Shammai take of the smicha shechita. Beis Shammai hold that you do not need to do the smicha right before the shechita. Avaloi oilos. However, we may not bring the oilas re'iyah on Yontif because they're not eaten but entirely burnt on the mizbeach. Rather, you have to bring them after Yontif, meaning either on Chalamoid or Shavuos. You have the following week to bring it. Beis Shammai learned this from a pasuk that the Torah is matter shechting and Yontif for meat only to provide for the needs of the people and not for the benefit of the mizbeach. Because it says atzeres tia lochem, and lochem is v'loy legavoyas, even though the mizbeach is achila, but it's not deemed oichel nefesh in the sense that you would be able to feed the mizbeach with that. Beis Hillel Oimrim, the Oilas Riyah of Pesach and Sukkot is brought on Chol HaMoed, and the Oilas Riyah of Shavuos, which is only a one-day Yontif according to the Midiraisa, is brought on one of the 6 days following the Yontif, as we'll see more about in Chagiga, Mr. Shem. Beis Hillel Oimrim, Beis Hillel say Mevin Shlama v'Oilas v'Simcha Aleim. You may bring both the Shalmei Chagiga and the Oilas Riyah and Yontif, because there's a pasuk to be mated this. The Torah says that Tzeres Lashem Elokecha. So Beis Hillel derived from this pasuk that even a Yom Tov offering brought for Hashem, meaning even for the Mizbeach, Oilas Riyah, may be brought on Yom Tov. The Mishnah refers only to personal kabbanis that are brought because of the Yom Tov. Everyone agrees, Sai Beis Shammai and Sai Beis Hillel, that any other personal shlomim and Oilah kabbanis may not be brought on Yom Tov. Furthermore, everyone agrees that all the kabbanis tzibur are brought on Yom Tov, even kabbanis Oilah, because that the Torah tells us to do explicitly, and that we know we could do that. So again, you bring the Shalmei Chagiga and the Oilas Riyah on Yontif, and we perform smicha on them on Yontif because the Chachamim lifted the Isser of leaning on an animal in the case of karbanis brought on Yontif. Beis Hillel ruled that smicha must be done, take of the smicha shchita, needs to be done right before the carbon is shechted. Therefore, when a carbon is brought on Yontif, since its smicha must be done that day, the Chachamim lifted their Isser of using animals in Yontif and were matir smicha. Okay, Mishnah Hey Vaiter. Beis Shammai Oimrim L'Yochem Odom Chamin L'Raglav Ela Im Ken Ru'uyim L'Shtia. Heating water is also on Shabbos because it's a malacha of bishul. Yet it's mutter on Yom Tov because cooking is for echel nefesh. So it's a malacha that's mutter. So the Mishnah deals with heating water on Yom Tov for purposes not for food. L'Yochem Odom Chamin L'Raglav Ela Im Ken Ru'uyim L'Shtia. Beis Shammai say a person may not heat water in Yom Tov to wash his feet, unless the hot water is also fit to drink, because the malacha of cooking is mutter and Yom Tov only for preparing food. Although a person is usher to heat water specifically for washing, he may heat water if he intends to drink at least some of it. Beis Hillel matirin, but Beis Hillel permit a person to heat water for this purpose in Yom Tov because they hold that once the malacha is mutter for the sake of echel nefesh, it's also going to be mutter for other needs as well. Beis Hillel accept the rule of mitoich, which states that since certain malachas are permitted on Yom Tov for the sake of Eichel Nefesh, then they're also going to be mutter for any other needs for Yom Tov as well. Therefore, according to Beis Hillel, since one may heat water to prepare food, one may also heat water to wash one's face, feet, and or hands. Oisa Odom Medura Umeschamim Kenegda, for the same reason, according to Beis Hillel, a person may make a bonfire on Yom Tov and warm himself before it. To make a barbecue on Yom Tov, that's perfectly fine, because that's klar for Eichel Nefesh. But this is just to keep yourself warm. Once you're making fires, and making fires is mutter on Yom Tov, lighting candles, we all like candles on Yom Tov, right? If you like candles on Yom Tov, you could turn on there may be makom to even turn on a stove. Can't really, you could turn on a stove if you have some fire that's burning there from before. But to make a barbecue on Yom Tov, to have a good steak, favos nicht. And people may say it's not in the spirit of Yom Tov, fine, that's something else. That's a different thing, but make her out, then it's fine. Mishnah Vav. Shloisha Dvarim Ram Gamliel Machme Kedivri Beis Shammai. In three matters regarding Yom Tov from Gamliel was Machmir, following the view of Beis Shammai. Gamliel he was from the descendants of Hillel. He followed the Shita of Beis Shammai in these three following halachas. In Temnin and Sachamin Yom Tov l'Shabbos, you may not insulate a pot of hot water on Yom Tov for use on Shabbos, even if Erev Tavshilin was made, because the standard Erev Tavshilin is not effective to be matter hatmana on Yom Tov for Shabbos. The Chachamim answered hatmana of hot water or hot food on Shabbos, for example, by wrapping it in wool. So by wrapping it in wool. So insulating, which the Mishnah calls hatmana, is forbidden even on Yom Tov if the water will not be used on Yom Tov. Similarly, if Yom Tov falls on Friday, one may not even do hatmana for the food on Yom Tov for that Shabbos, just as other acts of food preparation are also on Yom Tov for Shabbos, without an Erev Tavshilin. Beis Shammai take this a step weiter. They also insulating food on Yom Tov for Shabbos, even if Erev Tavshilin was made. According to Beis Shammai, an Erev Tavshilin allows only acts of food preparation that is similar to the ones done to make the Erev itself. For example, if one cooked food for the Erev, he may only cook food on Yom Tov for Shabbos, but may not bake bread. But if somebody baked bread for the Erev, he may only bake on Yom Tov for Shabbos, but not cook. Therefore, meaning it's the Erev Tavshilin is be'etzem limited. You can't just cook whatever you want and bake whatever you want. Therefore, if the Erev Tavshilin did not include hatmana, so then Beis Shammai asked doing hatmana for hot food or hot water on Yom Tov for Shabbos. They are matter a person to do hatmana for food on Yom Tov for Shabbos only if he did hatmana for the food of his Erev Tavshilin. A very interesting halacha. They still, on the other hand, hold that even if someone only cooked for the Erev, he may do any act of food preparation on Yom Tov for Shabbos, including hatmana, which is, like we spoke in the previous Mishnah, that their matter, mitaych is matter, a whole range of things. And you may not reassemble the parts of a candlestick on Yom Tov, because this resembles the malacha of Baina, which is also on Yom Tov. Beis Shammai hold that the malacha of Baina applies not only to buildings, but structures attached, meaning not only to structures that are attached to the ground, but also to kalim, objects not attached to the ground. The shita is known as yesh binyan bekalim. The prohibition of building applies to utensils as well. Putting back together the pieces of a candlestick, which resembles building, is thus asur on Shabbos and Yom Tov. It's not actual building, because this type of candlestick is made to be taken apart and reassembled. Ve'ein oifen pitin gritin elarikikin. You may not bake thick loaves, numerous loaves of bread on Yom Tov, if these are more bread than is needed for Yom Tov, because it's forbidden on Yom Tov to expend more effort than necessary. Rather, we may bake only thin loaves and the few loaves that we actually need. Beis Hillel, just one more nakuda in the previous halach. Beis Hillel, however, hold that the malach of building does not apply to utensils, ein binyan bekalim. According to them, one may reassemble a candlestick on Yom Tov, provided that the parts can be inserted without force. Okay. Then the next halach, the third halacha was, ein oifen pitin gritzen el rekikin. You're only allowed to bake a small amount of thin loaves that are necessary and not more. A large number of loaves is called thick because they were needed as one large thick dough. According to Beis Hillel, though, you may bake numerous loaves at one time, even if more bread than necessary will be produced. The reason is that filling the oven with many loaves leaves less empty space in the oven, which causes the heat to be more concentrated, which in turn causes the necessary loaves to bake better, which is not going to be a chesaron of the quality of how you bake it. Beis Shammai don't even Beis Shammai in a certain oifen don't make an issue if you want to increase the quality of the food that you're making. Maybe. I don't know if it's a passion. Okay. According to Beis Hillel, though, okay, we just explained that. Amr Gamliel said, in all the days of my father's household, the father of this Reb Gamliel was Reb Shimon ben Gamliel the first, who was a great-grandson of Hillel. So they would not bake thick loaves, numerous loaves of bread on Yom Tov, only a few loaves, thus avoiding extra effort. Chachamim said to him, what shall we do with this practice of your father's household? It doesn't prove that baking thick loaves is generally asur, because they were stringent in this matter for themselves. But they ruled leniently for all the other members of Klal Yisrael, and they allowed them to bake thick loaves of bread, even to make cold-baked bread, which requires even greater effort. Cold-baked loaves were large doughs baked directly on coals. To bake them properly, one had to make a very large pile of burning coals. Despite the additional tircha that was required to make this bread, Reb Gamliel's family was matter others to bake such bread on Yom Tov. Although the members of his own household refrained from doing so, this does not indicate that that's the halacha, because in this matter, they were machmir on themselves personally to go beyond the requirements of the law. And the Rabbi ends off in halacha Ram Gamliel b'chol ma shemachmir kedivei Beis Shammai. The halacha is not like Ram Gamliel with all the things that he was machmir like Beis Shammai. Okay, Mishnah Zayin. Avhu Omar shloisha dvarim lahakol. In addition to the three chumras that he mentioned from Beis Shammai, he also brings three kulas. Mechabdin ben amitis. You may sweep food from between the couches on which people were reclining during the meal. For there's little concern that such a small area one might fill in the small holes and thereby leveling the floor, which is the malacha of building, which is the malacha of baina. To be mashvi gumais. There's a problem on Shabbos. We spoke about this in Sefta Shabbos and Perek Ches, that there's a problem of being mashvi gumais, is filling the holes and leveling the floor. So mechabdim in amitais, in the times of the Gemara, people often reclined on couches when they ate. So mechabdim in amitais u'manichin as hamukmar b'yamtiv. He may place incense on burning coals on Yom Tov to emit a pleasant aroma, despite this being a malacha of kindling a fire, because it increases one's joy of Yom Tov. Here Ram Gamliel follows the sheet of Beis Hillel, that since the malachas are mutar for echel nefesh, they're also permitted for other Yom Tov needs, and to make good smells, so that's to make good aromas, that's good, that's you're allowed to do that. And you may roast a young goat together with its kishkis on Pesach night, because that's how the Korban Pesach was roasted, and one thereby commemorates this carbon. What's the problem with that? We know the halacha, even today we don't eat roasted meat on Pesach. The Torah requires the Korban Pesach to be roasted on a spit with its knees and kishkis on its side. Ram Gamliel was matter people in his time after the Churban Beis HaMikdash to roast a young goat, which was one of the animals that was eligible for the Korban Pesach in this manner, and eat it by the Seder, so that the carbon could be remembered. And Gamliel disagrees with the Chachamim, who asked this practice, because one who eats a goat roasted this way at the Seder appears to be being over on the Isra of eating kosher bachutz. But the Chachamim answered these three acts. They forbid sweeping between the couches, because it might lead to being mashvei gumais, filling in holes in the floor elsewhere in the house. They also answer placing incense on burning coals, because it's not the practice of ordinary people, and it's not considered a need for Yom Tov. The Torah says that which is eaten by all people, that alone may be done for you, right? It's only for people that are very mifunakim, and mifunakim, or to people who smell bad, and hopefully you clean yourself before Yom Tov, so that you don't need to do more than that. By adding all people, the pasuk teaches us that any malacha may be done in Yom Tov only for a need that is common to all or most people. A davar hashav l'chol nefesh. Therefore, burning spices to create a pleasant smell is not permitted on Yom Tov, because this was done only by a few, namely those who were especially particular about the aroma in the room, or those with strong body odor. So they assered roasting a young goat together with its kishkis on Pesach night, because this was a specific requirement of the Korban Pesach, and doing so might cause people to think that one is eating Korban Pesach outside Yerushalayim, which is Aser. Mishnah Ches. There are three kulas that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah had, three things that he was matir, and the Chachamim answered them. This is also mentioned in Shabbos and Perek. His cow would go out on Shabbos into Rosh Hashanah with a decorative ribbon between its horns, because according to him, a decorative ribbon is an item of clothing for a cow, so wearing it is not considered carrying. In general, a person is mechuyev on shvisas behemtoi. One of the malachas that a person is not allowed to let his animal do is haitzah, which is carrying an item from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah or vice versa. So included in this malacha is wearing an item that's not considered clothing. Nevertheless, Rabbi Elazar allowed a cow to be let out into Rosh Hashanah wearing a decorative ribbon, because he regards such a ribbon as an item of clothing for a cow. Although the Mishnah calls it his cow, it didn't belong to Rabbi Elazar. It belonged to his neighbor. But since he didn't stop his neighbor from letting it out on Shabbos this way, the cow is considered as though it were his own. And the Gemara in Shabbos goes to town with this about doing the right thing and telling people to not do Dvarim Asurim, to give people Muslim in the proper way, that they shouldn't be over any Surim. Mekarden sabahema be yamtiv, and he rules the one make curry, which means to scratch or scrape the body of an animal with a fine-toothed metal comb on yamtiv, even though the sharp teeth of the comb might prick the animal and make it bleed, which is usher because of the malacha of sheichet, because this is not intended. It's a davar she'eina miskaven, which is the term for an action that might result in a malacha taking place, but the person performing it didn't intend for that result to happen. In our Mishnah's example, the person who's scratching the animal might make a bleed, which is a malacha, but he didn't intend for this to happen. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon disagree whether such an action is permitted or osur. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah sides with Rabbi Shimon, who holds that it's mutter. V'sheichkin is a pilpul berechaim shalahem, and he also paskins that you may grind the pepperballs, the peppercorns, in small grinders that are made specifically for grinding them, even though the malacha of teichin is generally osur and yomtiv. According to him, this type of grinding, this type of teichin on a small scale using household items, household kelim, is not included in the isser of grinding on yomtiv. This is not even osur midrabanan on yomtiv, because the pepper would lose its flavor if they were ground the day before. The Chacham, however, disagree with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. According to the Chachamim, a cow may not go out into Rosh Hashanah with a decorative ribbon between its horns because it's not considered clothing, and they asser scratching an animal with a fine-toothed metal comb because it might make the animal bleed. The Chachamim hold like Rabbi Yehuda, the one is asser to perform any action that might result in a malacha, even if it was eina miskaven. And they also asser grinding peppercorns in a regular pepper grinder because doing so seems like a malacha of the weekdays. The Chachamim asser only the use of a pepper grinder. But they do allow you to grind pepper with a mortar and a pestle, as is the halacha with other spices. Kamavur, Begamar, the Kamavur, B'Shulchan Aruch. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Ein mekarden sabahema b'yamtiv v'neish oiseh chabura." You may not scratch an animal with a fine-toothed metal comb on yamtiv because it might make a bleeding wound in the animal. Aval mekartzefin, but you may scratch it with a blunt-toothed wooden comb because that will not make such a wound. The Chachamim say, "Ein mekarden afle mekartzefin." You may not use a metal comb or a wooden comb, because if a wooden comb would be allowed, people might think that all combs are allowed, even a metal one. So you state in Gemara, Yehuda and the Chachamim agree that an action that is unintentional might result in a malacha that is forbidden. Therefore, both aser using a metal comb, since bleeding might result. The Chachamim extend the iser to include a wooden comb in order to make sure that the people will also refrain from using a metal one. Okay, Mishnah Tes. Harechaim shall pilpulin temeya mishum shloisha kelim. The Mishnah discusses an application of the Hilchas Tumah V'Tara with respect to the pepper grinder that we mentioned in the previous Mishnah. So the Mishnah's ruling is based on the idea that an object cannot become tamei unless it's a complete utensil of some sort. So Harechaim shall pilpulin temeya mishum shloisha kelim. The pepper grinder can become tamei even when this is assembled in its three main parts, because these parts are three independent kelim. Mishum klei kibul, the bottom part which holds the ground pepper can become tamei because it's a container. The bottom part of the grinder is made of wood. The halacha of wood is that it's not considered a keli unless it has a klei kibul in which things can be held. Umishum klei matris, the top part, the pestle with which the pepper is pounded, can become tamei because it's a metal utensil. Unlike the bottom grinder, which is receptacle, over here there is no receptacle, there's no klei kibul in the upper part, in the pestle. So if it were made of wood, it could not become tamei. However, since the bottom is plated with metal to make the grinding more effective, it's considered a kli matris, metal, and it can become tamei even if it lacks a klei kibul. Umishum kli kvara, and the middle part, the mesh that sifts the ground peppers, allowing the powder to fall through and retaining the larger bits above, can become tamei because it's a sieve. Like the top part of the grinder, the middle section, the mesh, does not have a receptacle. So if it were made out of wood, it would have become tamei midiraisa. However, the Rabbanon were geyser that any mesh items that can become tamei because it resembles woven material, which is going to be mochel kabel tamei midiraisa. Vafilu ena kvar shamatches metame mishum kli kvara. Okay, very interesting halacha. It's kedai to keep these things in mind. Kedai to keep the Hilchos Tumah V'Tara in mind, even if it's not Sunigeh, the Masechta, or the Sugi that we're learning. But we always like to explain Hilchos Tumah V'Tara. It's very geschmack to know the halachas. The final mission of the parak, Mishnah Yud, Agala shall cut in Tamei Medris. Once we're talking about Tumah and Muktzah, we're going to continue with it. A child's toy wagon contracts Tumah's Medris, becomes an Ava Tumah if a child sits in it when he's a Zav, because it's made for a child to sit in. The halacha of Medris, which means being stepped on, is that when certain tamei people, including a zava or a nida, put their weight on an object, it becomes tamei with the same level of tumah as the person himself. It becomes an avat tumah. Usually, when one item transmits tumah to another, the tumah of the second item is weaker than the tumah of the first. In the case of medrash, however, the object that receives the tumah becomes tamei the same degree as the source of tumah. It doesn't go down. It's not an achois darg of a nitma. It's the same madrega, and it becomes tamei. This halacha applies only to an object that's intended to be used to support the weight of a person, like a chair or a bed. A child's wagon is included in this halacha since it's meant to support the weight of the child when he sits in it. Hence, if the child is off, his wagon becomes an avatuma like him. Then he tells us b'Shabbos, and it may be moved on Shabbos because it's not muktzah, it's something that the child can use. The enen igreres el al gabe kelim, but it may not be dragged on Shabbos except for over utensils, meaning clothing that cover the ground, because otherwise it will make a groove in the earth, which is usher because of the malacha of chayrish. Because it's chayfer b'karka, it's making a chritz in the karka, and it's going to be mechayiv mishum chayrish. Rabbi Yehuda says, Kala kelon ein igrarim, all heavy utensils such as chairs or tables or benches may not be dragged directly over the ground without clothing beneath them, because they make grooves in the earth. Except for a wagon, which may be pulled directly along the ground without any clothing beneath it, because it has wheels which do not make grooves in the earth, but merely roll over it and press it down. Although the surface of the ground is lowered by the wheels pressing down on it, this is not considered plowing, since no earth is loosened thereby.